Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Sunday, February 2nd, day 485 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our military reporter, Emmanuel Fabian. Hi, Manny. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Amanda.
Today, we'll learn what is happening on the ongoing counterterrorism operation in the northern West Bank, now in its 13th day. And IDF troops operating in a buffer zone in southern Syria came under fire on Friday. Is this just a one-off? Eyal Zamir has been named the next IDF chief of staff and is set to take over from March. We'll learn who he is and what his nomination represents. We'll hear why the defense minister is threatening one specific freed Palestinian security prisoner and whether all is quiet on the Egyptian border. All this and much, much more when we're back. Amid the excitement of yesterday's release of 3 Israeli hostages from the Gaza Strip and 183 Palestinian prisoners to Gaza and the West Bank, the Israeli military on Saturday carried out 3 drone strikes on terror operatives in the northern West Bank. The Palestinians are reporting 4 people killed and several others wounded. The strikes came as the IDF expanded an ongoing counterterrorism operation in the northern West Bank, now in its 13th day. Manny, what has been the scope of the operation so far?
So it began in the Jenin refugee camp, that is sort of the hotspot of terrorism in the northern West Bank. Many attacks have been launched from there. So troops were operating in the Jenin camp for several days and then expanded also to Tulkarm, which is also in the northern West Bank, but quite far from Jenin. And then overnight, we saw troops begin to operate in the Tubas area, which is closer to the Jordan Valley. So really across the entire northern West Bank area now, troops are now operating. We've seen nearly, I think, 30 Palestinians killed, the vast majority of them terror operatives. We did see a toddler killed in an apparent accident during one of these operations in a village near Jenin. I think one of the more major incidents during this entire raid is a drone strike that was carried out last week that killed 10 terror operatives in Tamun, which is next to Tubas. I think 5 or 6 of them were members of Hamas, others were Islamic Jihad and other unaffiliated terrorists. But that marked one of the most deadly drone strikes in the West Bank in quite a while.
Now, your guess had been, as the IDF pulls out of Gaza, that it would be rerouting troops into the West Bank. And is this what you're seeing play out? Is this part of this ramped up operation?
Indeed, yes. There is quite a large amount of forces operating in Jenin. The latest operation in the Tubas area, Tamun and Tubas area, is very close to each other. An entire IDF brigade is now operating there. So we are seeing the troops that were previously deployed to Gaza, there's nothing to do in Gaza right now during the ceasefire, being sent to the West Bank to carry out this major counterterrorism operation. I will note that the scope of this operation, of course, it seems to be large, but it does also seem quite similar to the previous operations we've seen in the West Bank in the past year in Jenin and in Nablus and in other areas. It has so far lasted quite a lot longer. We're 12 days in now on the 13th day. So we have to sort of wait and see how extensive this gets, because right now it does seem to be like a longer version of the sort of usual West Bank raids and not anything further. Time will obviously tell in this case whether or not this is something much more significant. We did see Defense Minister Israel Katz claim a few days ago that at the end of this operation, the IDF will remain in Jenin even afterwards. I'm not sure if that's something that the army will actually carry out. Remaining in Jenin isn't maybe the safest option, but we will see what choices are made by the army in the coming weeks.
As Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is currently on his way to Washington, D.C., Syria's transitional president Ahmed al-Sharaa will visit Saudi Arabia today in his first foreign trip since he assumed power, following a lightning rebel events that ousted Bashar al-Assad in December. Now, on Friday, Israel Defense Force troops operating in a buffer zone in southern Syria came under fire in the first such incidents since the Israeli forces deployed to the buffer zone on the border between Israel and Syria. This is also a place that our defense minister has said that Israel will remain, right, Manny? Now, the IDF said troops returned fire toward the source of the shooting, but who was the source of the shooting at the IDF soldiers, Manny?
So this is a strange case. There's this organization that has popped up called the Syrian Resistance, and it's apparently affiliated with the former regime. It's not one of the rebel groups that was fighting the Assad regime, but rather something new, and it has claimed responsibility for the incident. It posted something on Telegram, and Hezbollah-affiliated media in Lebanon also reported this, so it does seem to be some sort of actual organization. How many members they have or who's leading them, we don't know any of these details, but it does seem that there is some sort of threat to Israeli troops. Of course, they've been there for more than a month, and there had been no incidents of fire towards them at all until this first incident. No troops were wounded. I don't think that the soldiers were directly under fire. The shooting maybe missed them entirely. So, but this does sort of prove that what Israel has been saying, that there is a threat to Israel, to the Golan Heights border communities, and that's why troops are deployed in the Golan Heights, except it's not one of these rebel groups that Israel was worried about, but rather some sort of, I guess now it is a rebel group because it's rebelling against the current regime, which is made up of the former rebels.
And you have to wonder, is it a chicken and egg situation as well, Manny? Meaning the troops are there, so they're going to be shot at, or if there were not troops, these rebels of the rebels would have entered or attempted to enter Israeli territory?
It's a great question. I think that the real reason why Israel deployed there was anticipating a potential where, because of the power vacuum in Syria, then hostile forces to Israel would try and carry out attacks. It's very possible that now, because troops are there, they've become a target. This is something that is discussed in other fronts as well. If troops don't deploy to a certain area, then nobody will attack them. But I think Israel is taking extra precautions here, making sure that there's no chance that any hostile force will approach the border and attack an Israeli community there. Some of them are very close to the border. Israel doesn't want another October 7th to be carried out on any front.
So, of course, the army acts in accordance to the political directives it gets, but Major General Eyal Zamir, the Defense Ministry Director General, was tapped by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Israel Katz yesterday to become the next Chief of Staff of the IDF. You have to wonder if he will continue this line or what, but my first question to you is, have there been previous cases in which a reserves officer is pulled back into the army to head it?
This is actually the second time it's happened. Funnily, very similar circumstances after the 2006 Lebanon War, when Chief of Staff Dan Khalutz resigned over the failures of the Second Lebanon War. Gabay Ashkenazi, who was at the time the Defense Ministry Director General, returned to the army to become the Chief of Staff. And this is exactly what has happened now with Eyal Zamir. And Gabay Ashkenazi also was a Deputy Chief of Staff. So Eyal Zamir his last role in the army was Deputy Chief of Staff. He was then afterwards the Defense Ministry Director General. And Halevi is resigning similarly in response to failures in a war. Different failures, of course, but still resigning. And Eyal Zamir will return to the army to be the next Chief of Staff.
Now, unlike many, if not most, of the chiefs of staff of the past, Eyal Zamir is not a paratrooper, doesn't come from that background. One of my sons is a paratrooper, so I know it's a kind of a different animal in the army from his two siblings who are also fighters in the army. And how do you think that Zamir not being a paratrooper, how will this affect his leadership?
I think it will be very different in many ways, but also not in a lot of other ways, because in the end, senior officers are all kind of made in the same way. They all kind of go through many of the same roles later on in the military. A lot of them share very similar perspectives. From my experience of speaking to many top officers, a lot of them sound very, very much the same. But still, Eyal Zamir began his service in the armored corps. He was a tank commander. He commanded the 7th Armored Brigade and later the 36th Armored Division. So his initial background, his first 15, 20 years in the army were all tank roles mostly. So I do think that will be quite different. Of course, the armored corps and the paratroopers, the sort of the personality of the soldiers there are quite different. In the tanks, it's a lot more, I would say, a lot more discipline there, a lot more precaution. Tanks are dangerous machines. Paratroopers haven't actually carried out any paratrooping in a very long time. They're basically just infantry forces. So it will be very interesting to see how this affects his thinking with taking the army forward. We do know a few things that maybe differ from his predecessors, Halevi and even Kochavi, is that Halevi and Kochavi supported making the army smaller, closing units, making it a smarter army, and shuttering even tank forces. In 2014, many armored units were actually closed. Zamir, on the other hand, he comes from that armored background and has indicated in the past that he supports a bigger army. Of course, Halevi now supports a bigger army after October 7th, but beforehand supported a smaller army. We may see Zamir push forward, reopening many of these tank units. Of course, during the war, especially on the Gaza Strip, the armored corps played a very significant role in the dismantling of Hamas. So that may be one of the things that he pushes forward with the army in sort of changing the way that the army works. And I do think one of the main things that he will be focusing on when he enters the role on March 6th is appointing senior officers. So Defense Minister Israel Katz has held up the appointments of senior officers because he doesn't want Halevi to be the one appointing them. He also wants to see the investigations into October 7th completed first before appointing anybody. And another factor is the fact that once Halevi resigns, many other, I wouldn't say many, but several other top officers will also resign from the military. Of course, we've already seen the announcement of the Southern Command Chief. We will see others as well, those who were involved in the failures of October 7th, but are waiting for Halevi to resign first before also resigning. So once Zamir enters the role, he will be involved in appointing many top officers, top generals as well, and finding sort of a new way forward for the IDF.
We'll go to a short break. And we're back. The Israel-Egypt border has been largely peaceful since the two countries signed a peace agreement in 1979. It was Israel's first with an Arab state. But there are widespread drug smuggling attempts and have been for several years. And lately, we're increasingly hearing about weapons smuggling as well. So, Manny, you just visited this border a couple of weeks ago, and I wonder if you're hearing of some kind of likelihood that this border may heat up in a way that we're just not used to.
So yeah, I went to the Egypt border a couple of weeks ago and spoke to the commander of the region, the Paran Regional Brigade, and he, in an interview I held with him, gave quite a worrying warning about the Egyptian border and the fact that Israel's focus isn't really there all that much. Of course, the Egypt border has a large fence that was constructed there just over a decade ago. Between 2010 and 2013, Israel constructed this large barrier to prevent African migrants and Islamic terrorists in Egypt Sinai from crossing the border. And once it was all closed, humans stopped crossing over the border, but there were sort of drug smuggling attempts that continued. Growers of marijuana and other drugs, even heavier drugs, in the Sinai desert would smuggle them over, mainly in Israel, to Bedouins who live in the Negev desert, and they would then sell it off in Israel. in the past decade, and we've only mainly seen drugs being smuggled, but in the last few years, we've seen now weapons also being smuggled, handguns, assault rifles. So it's becoming a problem. And once October 7th happened, and even slightly before, when there was an attack on the Egyptian border a few months before October 7th, Israel changed its open fire policy on the Egyptian border. Anyone who approaches the fence gets shot at. And as a result, Israel believed, or the IDF believed, that they had basically solved the drug smuggling and the weapon smuggling issue that they had. But the smugglers then moved to another route, and that was using drones. And just a week ago, there was another incident like this, where on the Israeli side, suspects will arrive not up to the fence, but 3, 4, 5 kilometers away from the fence, lift up a drone in the air, fly it over to the Egyptian side, land it there, also a few kilometers in, and then the smugglers on the Egyptian side will load up the drone with contraband, mostly weapons these days, but also drugs, and then fly it back over to the Israeli side. And it took the IDF quite a few weeks to actually figure out this was going on, because they weren't looking for drones flying over this border, really. It's not the kind of border where you'd expect it. And they've deployed all these methods now, these electronic warfare systems to shoot down these drones or to take control of them or to jam them. But it's a learning process now. The IDF is saying it's going to take time before they can actually get a grip on this and stop this smuggling attempt. But what is worrying is that for the commander who spoke with me, Colonel Shamer Aviv, is that this could explode into anything else. Right now it's criminal smuggling, but it could turn into terrorism very easily. If criminals are using drones to smuggle weapons over the border, what's to say that a terror organization, a jihadist group in Sinai, can't use drones to drop explosives on troops or on a community in the Egyptian border area? So that is what is worrying for the commander. Maybe now with the focus taken away from Gaza, there'll be more focus on the Egyptian border.
And finally, Defense Minister Israel Katz yesterday threatened the released Palestinian prisoner and former terror chief Zakaria Zubeidi 2 days after he was freed as part of the hostage ceasefire agreement with Hamas, along with dozens of other prisoners. And Katz wrote on X, "Zakaria Zubeidi, you were released in an agreement for the sake of freeing Israeli hostages. One mistake and you'll meet old friends. We will not accept support for terrorism." Manny, his case is pretty interesting, as is his backstory, but why do you think that Katz is singling out Zakaria Zubeidi?
I think because he's kind of an icon in the Palestinian public. He was the commander of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade during the Second Intifada, orchestrated many attacks on Israelis. But besides that, he was involved in the theater in Jenin, and when he was rearrested several years ago and he was jailed, he was among those Palestinians who managed to escape the Gilboa prison, that infamous story, and they were captured several days later. And because of that, because of his involvement in the theater in Jenin, because of him being the chief of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, he's a very, very well-known figure, and there were celebrations for his release in Ramallah. He hasn't returned to Jenin yet because of the IDF's operation there. And Israel has been warning the Palestinians not to continue these celebrations, but that's, I think why, because he's this very prominent figure in the Palestinian public, for both the terrorism and for the other things that he has done in his life. And of course, the Gilboa prison break which was a very, I would say, very sort of notorious incident.
And well stage managed, actually, because they were out for several days, as you said. So perhaps the theater experience and all of his terror experience just melded together in that one very dramatic event. So Manny, thank you so much for joining me today and for all your insights and updates today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another episode tomorrow. This episode was produced by Zev Levy. Please, if you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to write us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, Shalom.